Olá. Eu acho que...
19.
Mário, acho que o vídeo começou...
A programação
tá bom.
curtas de 5 a 10 minutos, onde nossos discentes apresentam a semana da pós-graduação em Geologia da UFMG será exclusivamente online, respeitando os protocolos sanitários e de segurança da pandemia do Covid-19. A programação conta com diversas short talks, que são palestras curtas de 5 a 10 minutos, onde nossos discentes apresentam o tema das pesquisas que vêm desenvolvendo. Além disso, este ano nós trazemos um espaço para discussões temáticas entre docentes e discentes e palestras e mesa redonda de especialistas. Os vídeos serão exibidos tanto no nosso canal do YouTube quanto no nosso Instagram e ficarão disponíveis para que possa assistir no horário de sua melhor conveniência. Nos dias 22 e 23 de fevereiro, abordaremos as temáticas de hidrogeologia, geologia ambiental e risco geológico, além de trazer palestras sobre a produção intelectual na área de geociências e uma mesa redonda sobre risco geológico. Nos dias 24 e 25 de fevereiro, trazemos pesquisas com as temáticas de evolução crustal e recursos minerais associados.
Neste ano de 2022, o programa completa 34 anos de atividades. E em comemoração, a quarta semana traz uma novidade. Renovamos a nossa identidade visual, que está mais inovadora e moderna. A logomarca foi desenvolvida pela CRIA, UFMG, e traz referências ao estado de Minas Gerais, fazendo alusão à capital mineira através da forma da Serra do Curral. Há geociências nas cores terrosas, camadas litológicas e cavernas, além da referência à nossa casa, o Instituto de Geociências da UFMG, com a representação da Rosa dos Ventos e a Arena, local de debate, encontros e troca de ideias no IGC. O evento é uma realização do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Geologia da UFMG, organizado por mim, professora Rosaline, professor Tiago, William Viegas e discente Mariana Madeira, com patrocínio da Sociedade Brasileira de Geologia, Núcleo Minas Gerais, e parcerias com a BMGEL, Núcleo BH e Minas Júnior. Esperamos que aproveitem bastante a semana e muito obrigada a todos e todas.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Hello. Bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Welcome, everybody. And Alessia, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here today at this talk. And I'm going to invite Maíra, Professor Maíra, to introduce you, and then before you start your talk. And thank you so much. Maíra, please.
So, Alessia, it's a great pleasure to have you today with us. Alessia Borghini, I will give a brief introduction about Alessia. She's a metamorphic petrologist working mainly with fluid rock interactions and metasomatism during subduction of the continental crust to mantle depth. She has been using melting inclusions trapped in ultra-high to high-pressure ultramafic and mafic rocks as a tool to determine the nature of the fluid and better constrain the metasomatism and crust-mantle interaction. She obtained her bachelor and master degree at University of Torino in Italy, and then she moved to Potsdam in Germany to work on her PhD investigation under the guidance of Dr. Silvio Ferrero and Professor Patrick O'Brien. She is currently working as a postdoc in Potsdam at the University of Potsdam with focus on experimental petrology and geochronology to constrain deep metasomatism during the evolution of the Bohemian Massif in collaboration with the University of Milano and the University of Münster. So thank you, Alessia. It's a great pleasure to have you today. And yourself.
So I can start to share the screen.
Yeah, and sorry, just in case Alessia is going to leave to us her email, because after the talk, she has a few minutes only for discussion, because she has another appointment. And so I think you're going to write your email at the end of your talk, or
Or I can maybe send you an email or like leave it to you.
Oh, great. Okay.
I can send here on the comments your email.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
Can you see
Maida.
the screen?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's perfect.
So it's okay, perfect. Can I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So good afternoon to everybody. Today I will talk about melt inclusions in eclogite as a tool to investigate mantle metasomatism, so the interaction between a fluid or a melt and mantle rocks, and deep carbon cycle. And I will do that showing you examples from the Bohemian Massif. So just to give you an outline of my talk, I'm going to start introducing the problem, talking about subduction and what are primary melt inclusion, why we use them. Then I will talk about melt inclusions in eclogites and metasomatism, melt inclusions and deep carbon cycle, and I will give you some concluding remarks. So the subduction is a planetary scale process that is controlling the chemical cycle of water and CO2. There are two volatiles that are actually also important for life on Earth, but also the cycle of large ion lithophile elements such as cesium, rubidium, barium, and light rare earth elements. But it's also controlling partially the crustal differentiation and the mantle heterogeneity. For the talk of today, we will focus on this area of the subduction zone. And so I was talking about the fact that subduction controls the deep element cycles. So, but how does it happen? So during subduction, the slab can transport elements at mantle depth. And then those elements can be released in melts and fluids via processes such as partial melting or dehydration. And those melts and fluids that you see here, indicated with this blue arrow, can then interact with what they have around. They can either interact with the mantle or even with the crust itself. And then in the case of the subduction of the oceanic lithosphere, for instance, those fluids can metasomatize the mantle, but then can also be partially re-emitted into the back to the atmosphere, closing the cycle via volcanic eruption at the arc. So the study of deep element cycles, but in particular about carbon, have focused mainly on the oceanic lithosphere. And continental crust has often been left a bit overlooked, despite the fact that we know that it can contain carbon, but also other incompatible elements. And so it could carry them during subduction. So today we will focus on the subduction of the continental crust, and in particular, we will try to understand the nature of the crust-mantle interaction, but also what could be the role of the continental crust for the deep carbon cycle. And we will try to reach both of those goals looking at primary melt inclusions in eclogite. But what are primary melt inclusions? So primary melt inclusions are small droplets of melt that are trapped in minerals during their growth in the presence of a melt phase. And we recognize them from secondary inclusion, for instance, because they are randomly distributed inside the crystals. So here you see two examples from melt inclusions in spinel and melt inclusions in olivine. Melt inclusions in metamorphic rocks can appear as glass, but they are generally very rare. They occur for less than the 10% in the whole cluster, or as polycrystalline inclusion. And here you can appreciate the fact that this inclusion is polycrystalline because every different shade of gray corresponds to a different phase in the inclusion. So those polycrystalline inclusion are in melt inclusion with a cryptocrystalline aggregate that in this particular case has a granitoid composition. So it would have albite, quartz, cave feldspar, biotite, micas in general. And so they are called nanogranitoids, but actually in 2020, Bartoli and Cesare proposed a new names to define this polycrystalline inclusion. They proposed to call them nanorocks because from like 2015, when the definition of nanogranitoids was proposed, until now, actually many other type of melt inclusions have been found with the composition that goes from silicic to carbonatitic. So in order to be more inclusive, they proposed this nanorock term. But for the talk of today, nanogranitoids is totally fine. So the study of melt inclusion started in 1858 with the contribution of Henry Clifton Sorby from the University of Sheffield that discovered the first glassy and crystallized melt inclusion in magmatic rocks. And he did that using this microscope that you see in the picture. And what you see instead on the right are the drawings that he did of the observation he was doing at the microscope. But it's not until 2009 that actually the study of melt inclusions was applied to metamorphic rocks. And 2009 was actually a turning point for the study of melt inclusion because for the first time, migmatites have been studied, or melt inclusion in migmatites have been studied by Cesare et al. So the rocks are the migmatite of Kerala Condalite belt in India. And they had a look a bit more into detail into the garnet. In the internal part of the garnet, you see that there are all these black dots. Those black dots, if are looked at with a higher magnification, are either glassy inclusions or polycrystalline inclusions with an assemblage mainly made of biotite, K-feldspar, quartz, and albite. So basically the composition of a granite. And this study was very important because it's actually the first direct study of melt composition. Before 2009, in fact, the study of migmatites and the determination of the composition of the melt, the anatectic melt, was just assumed via experimental petrology and thermodynamic modeling, but never directly measured. So, as I said, melt inclusions provide direct information on the nature of the melt involved in partial melting processes, but they also provide physicochemical conditions. So they can actually provide pressure and temperature condition of entrapment. And they become very useful tools when the large-scale correlation is difficult because of a lack of outcrops. And this is actually the case of the Bohemian Massif. So as you probably have seen from the title, the target of today are eclogite, of the eclogite of the Bohemian Massif. So the eclogite is a rock that is dominated by garnet and clinopyroxene. The garnet are those red dots. All the rest in the matrix is clinopyroxene, the green one. And those garnet contain melt inclusion that are randomly distributed, so they are primary. In general, those eclogite crop out as layers and lenses in peridotite surrounded by granulites, or as boulders in the granulites. But before going into detail into the eclogite, I just want to give you some information about the Bohemian Massif. So the Bohemian Massif, as you can see from this map, is located in Central Europe. It's actually centered in Czech Republic. Here you see the city of Prague. But it's also touching Germany from this side, Poland from this side, and Austria in the south. So the Bohemian Massif represents the core, the crystalline core of the Variscan orogenic belt, and it formed due to two stages of subduction and a continent-continent collision. The first subduction is an oceanic subduction, took place 370 million years ago. And the rocks related with this stage are reported in the map with this dark yellow, and they are mainly eclogite and spinel peridotite. The second stage of subduction sees instead the subduction of the continental crust, took place 340 million years ago, and the rocks related with, or the units related with this stage are actually reported in the map with this brown. And the rocks contained in the unit are mainly granulites, eclogite, and garnet peridotite. This stage of subduction was the stage that experienced the most extreme condition in fact, the rocks have been metamorphosed in coesite and sometimes even diamond stability field, which would mean that they have been subducted at least for 100, 150 kilometers of depth. And they're actually also the focus of the talk of today. So today we will look at some eclogite from the Saxon-Thuringian zone. And in particular, we will focus on the Granulitgebirge and the Erzgebirge. So the Granulitgebirge is an oval-shaped dome that is dominated in the core by granulites. Actually, the Granulitgebirge is the type locality for granulites, but contain quite uncommon granulites because they are high pressure. Actually, the core equilibrated at pressure around 2.2 GPa and temperatures higher than 1,000 degrees. But in the core, there are not just granulites, but there are also mantle bodies that are reported with this purple. And they are mainly garnet peridotite that now are serpentinized. And those garnet peridotite contain layers and lenses of garnet pyroxenite and eclogite. And today we will look at the eclogite from the Klatschmule and from Rubinberg. So, as I said before, they are dominated by garnet and clinopyroxene. They also contain secondary plagioclase, amphibole, and biotite. And the garnet contain melt inclusion, randomly distributed, so primary. The most abundant melt inclusions are the polycrystalline one, so the nanogranitoids. They show a well-developed negative crystal shape, as you see from this one, but also from the other. And this shape is imposed by the host after the entrapment, but before the crystallization. And they range in size between 5 and 25 micrometers. So we have to apply modern petrology to understand which are the phases that are present inside the nanogranitoids. And we used micro-Raman spectroscopy and EDS mapping, so chemical maps, to define which were the different phases inside. And they are condicolite or albite, phlogopite, ozumilite, cochetavite, and then a variable amount of quartz, white mica, orthopyroxene, and calcite. I'm pretty sure I have already overwhelmed you with some names. So condicolite and cochetavite are two polymorphs of feldspars. Condicolite is actually the orthorhombic polymorph of albite. Cochetavite is the hexagonal polymorph of K-feldspar. They have been discovered for the first time in 2009 and 2004 by Wang in the Bohemian Massif. That's why they have those names. And they can be recognized from their stable counterparts, so from albite and K-feldspar, using Raman spectroscopy. And this is the spectrum of the cochetavite. This one instead is a composite spectrum of condicolite and cochetavite. They have been discovered for the first time in nanogranitoids in 2016 in the Bohemian Massif by Ferrero et al. And they have been defined by those authors as typical metastable phases of chemically preserved nanogranitoids, regardless of the protolith or the pressure. So we can say that because actually they have been reported in different type of rocks, from eclogite to felsic granulites, and also at different pressure. So they have been reported at 1 GPa, but also at 4.5 GPa. So pressure and the composition of the protolith are not influencing their crystallization. But what is important is that they indicate that the inclusion is chemically preserved, because every time you would see cracks that are crossing the whole garnet, that would indicate that inclusion as exchange elements with the host, then you will find albite and K-feldspar and not condicolite and cochetavite. So they're basically telling us that that in that inclusion, the original information about the melt is preserved. In the same cluster with the nanogranitoids, there are also glassy inclusion. They are generally smaller as you can appreciate from this picture. They range in size between 2 and 5 micrometer. They can trap some rutile. Here you can appreciate them in the transmitted light. And this is the typical Raman spectrum. So you would see a main band between 400 and 500, and then a classical asymmetrical band in this position that is the OH bands in the glass. So the presence of glass is very, very important because it's actually allowing us to directly measure the composition of the melt. We just use the microprobe, and if the inclusion is big enough, it has to be bigger than 1 micron, we can actually measure it. And the presence of glass and the main mineral assemblage in the nanogranitoids, so an assemblage that would remind of a granite, suggest or confirm that those inclusions were melt inclusions. When we look at nanogranitoids to determine the composition of the melt from them, we need to do an additional step, because now in the nanogranitoid there are different phases with elements that are distributed in the different phases. So what we do is to perform re-homogenization experiments. Those experiments were performed at the GFZ, and basically the principle is to bring the garnet with the melt inclusion inside at the pressure and temperature conditions at which the garnet was growing and the melt was trapped as droplet. So we go back to those conditions, and then we decrease very fast the temperature in order to do not allow to the drop of melt to crystallize, and so to sort of freeze as glass. And this process is called quench. So we use 1050 degrees and 2.2 GPa for as pressure and temperature condition, and this is how they look like when they are successfully rehomogenized. So you don't see anymore the different shade of gray. You see just one color, and we verify the fact that they were glass using the Raman. So here you see the Raman spectrum again, with the classical band in this location between 400 and 500 centimeters at the -1, and then the asymmetrical bands of OH. We measure the composition, and the melt is granitic, is also hydrous, is high in alkalis, and is mildly paraluminous. To have more information about which were the phases or the phase involved in the partial melting reaction, so which were the phases that produced this melt, what we did was to perform trace elements analysis. And we performed them at the ETH in Zurich with the laser ablation. And what you see is that the melt is mainly enriched in cesium. So the melt that of my eclogite is the one with the light blue. And so you see that it's enriched in cesium, lead, rubidium, lithium, and boron, which are all elements related with the typical of the continental crust that would suggest then the involvement of a crustal component, possibly a white mica, considering the fact that we are at high pressure, is probably the high pressure version of a white mica, so a fengite. And this has been confirmed by the comparison of my data with the one reported by Acosta Vigil in 2010 for melts in metasediments, where the involvement of a white mica was confirmed by the finding also of relics. And so was probably, one of the main phases producing the melt was white mica. But white mica cannot account the enrichment in thorium and uranium, for instance. And so those two elements probably are related with the involvement of a fluid in the subduction zone. So now let's move to the Erzgebirge and let's see if there are similarities or differences. So the Erzgebirge is another oval-shaped dome that is divided in different units. The one that we care of for today is the gneiss eclogite unit, is the one here in the center. The sample I studied are coming from Seidenbach. Seidenbach is a locality in which there are lenses and blocks of eclogite. The eclogite are reported in the map with these black dots. So lenses and blocks of eclogite. surrounded by ultra-high pressure diamond-bearing gneisses. The pressure and temperature conditions determined for this unit are actually quite extreme. The pressure is higher than 4.5 GPa and the temperature is higher than 1000 degrees. So the eclogite also here is made of garnet and clinopyroxene. There is a minor amount of quartz and some rutile as accessory. But what is interesting is, of course, the presence of primary melt inclusions. So you see them here mainly, but actually they are all over the place in the garnet. Like you see, also those black dots are all melt inclusions. And what is even more interesting is the fact that they are sharing their spot in the garnet, so they are in the same microstructural position with other type of inclusion, those inclusions that are inclusions of polycrystalline quartz with radial cracks, as you can see here, that can be interpreted as quartz pseudomorph after coesite. And coesite is a mineral indicator of ultra-high pressure conditions. Which is not a surprise in this case study, because as I told you, it's a unit that experiences very extreme condition. But this would actually suggest us that the garnet was growing in presence of melt, but also in presence of coesite, and the melt-related processes was taking place at ultra-high pressure conditions, so at least at 120 kilometers of depth. So, as I said, in the garnet, there are primary melt inclusions. Also, in this case, of course, nanogranitoids are the most abundant. They have been investigated with the same techniques used for the other case study. Also, here you can appreciate the negative crystal shape. And here, the main mineral assemblage is pundicolite, biotite, quartz, or sometimes cristobalite, white mica, cucetavite, calcite, and then two phases with main Raman peak at 430 and 412. What we noticed was that some of the nanogranitoids, especially the bigger one, contained yield cracks that you see here indicated with this yellow arrow. They contain yield cracks with formation of new garnet. And so those were not then considered for the estimate of the composition of the melt. So phase 430 and 412. So there are two phases that do not have a name yet because we don't know what they are still. So they are currently under investigation. We're doing some, Ferrero and Wirth are doing some TEM analysis to better determine their structure. What I can tell you is that if you look at this, so this is a picture, a backscattered image of phase 430. And what I can tell you is that it's very light gray. So this means that it's made of light elements such as silicon, potassium, calcium, sodium, and aluminum. And this has been then later confirmed by the microprobe. But yeah, even having the composition, we still cannot give them a name. So this phase is more similar to, in terms of composition, to a glass. This one is more similar to a feldspar, but this one is not a glass because it contains peaks of, it has a crystalline structure, so it cannot be a glass. And another information that we get from the Raman is that generally the main peak of a phase at the Raman of phases corresponding to the same crystalline group would pop up in the same more or less position in the spectra. So for instance, like you would have the same main peak of all the carbonates more or less in the same area as well as for the phyllosilicates and so on. And in this case, the main peak in this position is, for instance, typical of tectosilicates such as coesite, quartz, feldspars. But yes, stay tuned. We still don't know what they are, but soon we will have an answer. So in the same microstructural, in the same cluster with the nanogranitoids, also in this case, there are glassy inclusions. Also in this case, they are a bit smaller than the nanogranitoids, as you can see. They are rare. Also, in this case, they occur for less than the 10% of the whole cluster. And most of them, in this case, contain a shrinkage bubble. They can drop rutile. Here we see the Raman spectrum with the classical band, the asymmetrical one. They have been, they are very important, of course, like we can measure directly the composition of the melt. Also here we perform re-homogenization experiments, but in this case, since the pressure was very high, it was not possible to do experiments using the piston cylinder, because the piston cylinder that were available at the GF set can go maximum to 4 GPa. So we performed the experiment with the multi-anvil press at the University of Milano, La Statale, and we performed the experiments at 1000 degrees and 4.5 GPa. We measure the composition of the melt. The melt is granitic, is hydrous, is high in alkalis, and is mildly peraluminous. We also did the trace elements, and also here you see that, that the melt is enriched in cesium, rubidium, lead, lithium, and boron, suggesting the involvement of the continental crust or continental crust component in the melt-producing reaction. Possibly fengite, because we are at UHP, ultra high pressure conditions. And the presence of thorium and uranium also in this case could be related with involvement of the fluid in the subduction zone. So now we know that there was a melt, that during subduction there was the production of the melt that got trapped in the eclogite. But now the next question is this melt internally produced? So is the result of the partial melting reaction of the eclogite, or is it coming from the continental crust and is then interacting with the mantle? So what I did was to, well, first of all, to compare the two melts that I measured. And as you can see, they have a very similar composition. And then to compare these melts with melts obtained experimentally by the partial melting of metabasalts. And as you can see, most of those melts would plot in the tonalite or trongemite field. But they don't look so similar to the granitic, to the one I measured. Instead, the comparison with melts from metabasalts, and those are all melts. So the one with circular natural melts, the squared one are experimental one, but they're all melts produced at high pressure. And as you can see, the composition is quite similar in terms of measure elements. If we have a look at the trace elements, we will see also here that the two melts in the high pressure eclogite and ultra high pressure eclogite are actually very similar. And this would suggest a similar source of the melt. That might suggest also a similar genetic process. And since they are more akin to melts of metasediments, and the trace element signature is suggesting the involvement of a crustal component, a continental crust component, probably those melts are coming from the partial melting of the continental crust, and so they represent a metasomatic agent that was probably interacting with the mantle. But then how does the eclogite form? So in my paper in JMG, we envisaged a scenario that would explain this. So here you see the continental crust, the lithospheric mantle, the astenospheric mantle, and the oceanic crust. So while the continental crust was subducted at mantle depth was melting. And once the melts were produced, they could actually interact with the mantle wedge, but also with some other elements inside the continental crust itself. And we propose that the production of the eclogite in the Granulitgebirge, since those eclogite occur as lenses inside a mantle body, are the result of the interaction of this melt and the mafic layers in the mantle. While in the case of the Erzgebirge, you have what we see in the field is the presence of boulders surrounded by granulites. In that case, possibly the melt was interacting with some mafic layers that were already present in the continental crust prior subduction. So, but now let's see. So now we know that like we produced the melt. This melt was interacting with the mantle. But what about the deep carbon cycle? So we know that there was a melt that was carrying elements. So for this purpose, we decided to target the melt inclusion trapped at ultra high pressure conditions, because it's known that CO2 is more soluble at high pressure. So we could have had better data. Let's say if we were considering the melts trapped at higher depth. And what we did was to measure the content of water and CO2 in glassy inclusion, but also in the re-homogenized nanogranitoid, using a nanosims at the Museum of Natural History of Paris. We measured the composition. In the case of the glass inclusion, since there is shrinkage bubble, we took in account the fact that part of the CO2 would go into the bubble, and then we recalculated the amount of CO2 that was in the bubble, and we added to the value measured. In the case of nanogranitoids, it was not necessary, because once you do the re-homogenization, you actually redissolve the CO2 into the melt. And what we obtained are those data that are actually, they plot in the same area with other melts in continental crust, but it's not surprising the fact that the CO2 content is higher, because they also have been trapped at higher pressure. But in general, the amount of CO2 measured is around 20,000 ppm, which would correspond to 2 weight%, more or less. Taking this data, we use it to calculate the amount of CO2 that was present in the bulk, necessary to reproduce the values that we were measuring in the melt inclusion. And then with this information, together with the thickness of the sedimentary cover, knowing the length of the orogenic belt and the burial rate, we calculated a carbon flux during the metamorphic peak, so between 360 and 240 million years. And so what we obtain for the whole sedimentary cover is a value that goes very, very close to this one, to the one of the sediments related with the oceanic lithosphere. But then, considering the fact that probably during the subduction, not all the sediments were actually mobilized, and considering the fact that the ultra high pressure terrain in the Erzgebirge, with the ultra high pressure terrain in the Erzgebirge are just occupying the 20% of the map, the minimum values of carbon flux that we come out with is 12 plus minus 5 megatons of carbon per year, which is a value that is similar to the flux that is produced in the serpentinized mantle that is part of this oceanic lithosphere, and is also similar to the amount of carbon that is expelled in the mid-oceanic ridges. But the difference between the subduction of the continental crust and the subduction of the oceanic crust is that during the subduction of the oceanic crust, you have here the formation of a volcanic arc, and so part of the carbon will go out again. While in the case of the continental subduction, there is no formation of a volcanic arc. So the amount of carbon that is mobilized during the subduction would actually ultimately be stored in the continental crust and in the mantle, not allowing the cycle to close, the cycle to close. But what does it all mean altogether? So let's go back to the metasomatism. So I took the melt I measured, that is let's call it metasomatic agent, and I wanted to compare it with other metasomatized mafic rocks just to see if there were any correspondence. And actually you can see that the trend is very similar. And this would suggest the fact that similar melts were responsible for the metasomatism of different portions of the Bohemian Massif, of the Bohemian Mantle. This is even confirmed by the matching trend with the Durbachite. So the Durbachite are ultrapotassic igneous rocks that attract a lot the attention because they formed due to the partial melting of a metasomatized mantle. But what attracts the attention is that they are igneous rocks with a composite trace element signature. So part of the trace element signature is reflecting the fact that they are forming by the partial melting of a mantle. But another part of their trace element signature is more related with the metasomatic agent that interacted with the mantle, and authors before had interpreted it as interpreted this metasomatic agent as a mature crustal component, and the fact that those elements related with the crustal component are matching with the melt I measured in the eclogite is actually telling us that there was extensive metasomatism of the mantle beneath the Bohemian Massif. So this melt was moving, was interacting with the mantle, but was actually also storing carbon. And if we consider the 20 million years span of the peak of the metamorphic peak of the Baryska orogeny, we would see that we would store actually 10 to the power of 5 gigatons of carbon in the roots. So I hope that I convinced you that melt inclusion represents a powerful tool to obtain fundamental information on crust-mantle interaction and the deep carbon and incompatible element cycle, and that I also convinced you that the carbon cycle is not limited to the subduction of the oceanic lithosphere, but it might carry on it might carry on with the subduction of the continental crust. So I haven't obtained all these results alone. So I would like to thank all the people that collaborated with me in those years. And I also want to thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Alessia, for your amazing presentation. It was great. Professor Gilberto from UFMG congratulated you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I know it's a bit different topic for us here because of to use like the experimental petrology with the investigation of the nanogranitoid inclusions. And I know we are also running out of time, but I would like to ask you a short question.
Go.
If you, yeah. I mean, because so do you have like a melt that resemble like those from Silvio Ferrero from 2016, like the nanocarbonatides, or
so the point is, I haven't compared them, I have to say. Like, I haven't compared my granitic melt with the nanocarbonatite from Silvio. But what I can tell you is that it will be different because if you look at already the main mineral assemblage, like in a case you have a granite, in the other one you have carbonates together with some other phases. So they will be definitely different, but it's actually, would be also interesting to do some more analysis on them to see how they can contribute to the carbon cycle, for instance.
So you don't have like carbonates in your inclusions like he has, right?
I do have
it's carbonates,
like but they're not dominant. I have calcite.
They are not dominant.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's one of the phases of the inclusion.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
was wondering if you have so much CO2, it was nice to have the comparison with the Bruno's work, I think, right, from Ibreazon.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was wondering where the tiny inclusion holds so much CO2.
In the calcite, actually.
Mhm.
In the
Yeah.
calcite. And I mean, I compared the data with the one of Bruna, but Bruna, so her work was done on rocks that were of the lower crust. So they have been, I think that they didn't see more than 1 GPa. So the problem there, I mean, the problem with the CO2 is that it doesn't like to stay in the melt. So as soon as you have low pressure, it's gonna solve.
And become the bubble,
Yeah,
like
yeah, or like go away at all, like completely, like the gas away. So like yeah, probably also in the case of in my case, let's say I have I have more CO2 because the inclusion were trapped at higher pressure, so more CO2 was soluble into the melt, was staying there, was not degassing away.
Okay, that's nice.
So it
Yeah.
would be actually cool to collect more data in UHP stuff.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Eh,
And you do have like CO2 inclusions, like just fluid inclusions as well, right?
no,
No? Ah, okay. That's
no. In
something
my case, I just
interesting
have
too.
melt inclusions. Yeah.
Okay.
It's all
And
there.
Alessia, just quick question to finish. I know, but I think maybe people might be curious about. I know because we have discussed. Do you have melt features in your rock that could, I mean, any other
Yeah.
feature that could resemble melting?
No. The short answer is no. I mean, that's what was also quite, how to say, exciting of my case study is that I had melt inclusions in a garnet, in an eclogite, with a granitic composition, which, I mean, I didn't stress it maybe too much, but it's very strange to have granitic melt in
Yeah.
an eclogite. But then I don't have any of the features that were observed, like, for instance, those melt pseudomorphs, so those sort of small films. I mean, in one of the case study, I can see something like that, but just like some little films. But that's it. That's the only thing that I can see. Beside the
Yeah.
fact, of course, that there are melt inclusions.
Your work is amazing, Alessia. Thank you for sharing
Thank
with
you.
us. We have provided your email because you know you are a bit running out of time, and also because of the time many people can watch later. And yeah, thank you so much. And I hope one day we can bring you in person to give
I
a
would
talk here
love
in
to.
Belo
I would
Horizonte.
love to.
Yeah, that would be great. So thank you so much. And yeah, we keep in touch.
And thank you
And
for inviting me.
yeah, it was great. So
Yeah, so I will run away.
yeah, you're a bit running out of time. Yeah.
And yeah, so have a nice day, and we will see.